The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Now, earlier this week, Parliament passed the Maintenance of Racial Harmony Bill, a significant piece of legislation aimed at strengthening Singapore's long-standing commitment to racial harmony. Now, this new legislation consolidates existing laws aimed at preserving racial harmony while introducing additional safeguards, such as restraining orders against individuals who create content that could threaten racial cohesion, a community remedial initiative for less severe offenses, and new measures to prevent foreign interference in race-based entities. And while the bill has been widely supported, it has also raised important questions about its implications for free speech enforcement and whether it could have unintended consequences. So how will authorities exercise these powers judiciously? Will it have a chilling effect on public discourse about race? And how will the new foreign influence safeguards impact cultural and business associations? Well, to help us unpack these issues, joining us today is Associate Professor Eugene Tan from the Singapore Management University at the School of Law. Hi, Professor. Welcome back to the show.
Good evening, Hongbin.
Good evening to you as well. Professor, let's start by discussing the broader context of the Maintenance of Racial Harmony Bill and what it means for Singapore's social context. I mean, this bill consolidates existing laws while also introducing new safeguards to strengthen racial harmony. What exactly is this bill about, and why is this legislation, a significant milestone for Singapore? What kind of challenges does it seek to address?
Well, Hongbin, as the name of the legislation indicates, it is really a piece of law that seeks to maintain racial harmony. And as you mentioned earlier, it consolidates, all the government's powers in one comprehensive piece of legislation. So in a way, if the government has to deal with threats to racial harmony, the first port of call, would be the Maintenance of Racial Harmony Act. But to be clear, this does not mean that there are no other legislation, that deals with threats to racial harmony, but by and large, this will be, the law that will be resorted to. And the law also creates, a presidential council for racial and religious harmony. And I think, when we look at this legislation in its entirety, I think it seeks to produce or enable more legislative levers, for the government, to deal with a variety of threats to racial harmony. Right? If we could look back, before this when this law comes into effect, sometime later, it will give the government additional measures that it didn't have before. So for example, measures such as the restraining order, to prevent someone from continuing to make speeches or act in a manner, that would threaten racial harmony. There is also the community remedial initiative, that seeks to have a non-punitive measure, where it is appropriate, for people, who may have offended a racial community. So I think it's not just about giving more power to the government, but rather it is also to signal, the importance of racial harmony to Singapore. And this being SG60, I think it's worth remembering how we became an independent country. Right? We had a different view of how society ought to be organized, one that is based on citizenship, Singaporean, rather than whether you belong to a particular race, that then entitles you to privileges and special rights.
I see. Well, historically speaking then, Singapore has taken a firm stance on maintaining racial harmony. So how does this bill kind of build upon past legislative efforts then?
I think that's a good point, right? Because, some people say, aren't we in a good state where racial harmony is concerned? Does this law suggest that things are not so good? I think, it's precisely because when the going is good that I think it becomes important to then ensure, that our laws are updated. And by that I mean, we are looking at how threats to racial harmony has also evolved. Social media didn't exist, a decade ago or so. We are looking at also foreign interference, now becoming, a more popular type of warfare, but used by external actors, that have ill intent against us. And we're also looking at Singaporeans' experiences across the different generations, towards race being different. So someone who saw the racial riots of 1964 would have quite a different view of race, from someone, born after 2000, for example. So where, I think one could say that, among the Gen Zs and millennials, some of them may take the view that we are post-racial, that race shouldn't matter at all. So I think this law seeks to ensure that the laws remain up to date and that people are sufficiently sensitized, to the importance of racial harmony.
I see. Well, during the parliamentary debate, Minister K. Shanmugam, pointed out that no orders have been or ever been issued under the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act since its introduction in 1990. Does this indicate that such laws serve more as deterrence than active enforcement tools? And do you think that will be the case with this new bill?
So I think it's useful to just mention about the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, from which, the Maintenance of Racial Harmony Act draws some inspiration from. In particular, the restraining order mechanism. And so I think you're right to say that both the religious harmony as well as the racial harmony laws, they serve as a deterrent as well as, giving the government active enforcement tools. And so what do we mean by that? When we talk about active enforcement tools, it is often the case that a wrongdoing, a criminal offense, had been committed. Then that's when the law kicks in. But when we look at the law as a deterrent, I think the whole intent is that there are measures within the law, either by the sanctions, the jail time or the fine, or measures such as the restraining order, that ensure, or at least help to ensure that you don't have the wrongdoing committed in the first place. Right? Because when the wrongdoing is committed, then you have to throw the rule book. You will then have to perhaps even resort to punitive sanctions, such as jail time. But whereas if it acts as a deterrent, right, when you have, one could look at the restraining orders in a way like a circuit breaker, right? So when the racial disharmony load gets a bit too high, the restraining order mechanism kicks in, and enables, the authorities to put a stop, to someone who is on the verge of threatening racial disharmony. So I think, the racial harmony law, like its religious harmony equivalent, will serve both as a deterrent as well as providing, additional enforcement tools.
I see. Well, now let's take a look at what the bill really entails here. I mean, one of the key provisions of the bill is the introduction of restraining orders against individuals who create content that threatens racial harmony. Now, while the government has assured that these powers will be used judiciously, some have raised concerns about free speech. Do you think these concerns are justified? I mean, how can we strike a balance between safeguarding harmony and ensuring space for legitimate discourse?
So yes, I think that's a very important question that you have raised. And I think first I would say that we shouldn't confuse free speech and irresponsible speech. I think when you look at free speech, I think it is important to recognize that free speech is only meaningful and worth protecting where it is responsible speech. I think speech which is irresponsible, for example, it sows discord, it incites violence and all, I'm not sure that those are the sort of speech, that is worth protecting. And of course, there is concern that, with the restraining order mechanism, freedom of speech, would be curtailed. But I think it is important to recognize that this new law, right, does not prohibit discussions about race. And in fact, it does have within the law the provision for the defenses of private conduct and raising matters in good faith, right? So what is meant by that? The defense of private conduct, enables people to freely discuss race in a private or domestic setting with the requirement, that parties who are not privy to the discussion, will not be able to listen into what's happening, simultaneously or after that. So, people are free, communities are free to discuss, in a private setting, their concerns about race that perhaps affect them individually or as a community. when we talk about the defense of raising matters in good faith, this means that, even if you have raised a matter, that could on its own, be seen to be threatening racial harmony, the defense of raising a matter in good faith means that an individual or a community can call out race-related issues that requires attention, such as racial discrimination, or, where you have offensive matters against any particular race, to bring about racist issues, such that there would be the removal, of these matters. So I think the concerns with freedom of speech, I think they are legitimate, but I think it would be wrong to characterize this law, as enabling the government to shut down any discussion relating to race that it is uncomfortable or that it finds inconvenient, right? And I say that because the law provides these defenses, and so anyone who is dealt with the law, where there is a justification for these defenses to apply, then the person would be adequately protected by the law. But I would say, Hongbin, very quickly, that the restraining order mechanism, to my mind, actually promotes and protects responsible speech. Right? I think that sometimes, we all say, that you encourage self-censorship. But I think the fact is self-censorship is important. It is important because, we shouldn't just speak whatever comes to our mind, right? We need to ensure, to check ourselves. So I would say that, having the care as to how our speech could affect racial harmony will, in reality, promote and protect free speech as well as responsible speech.
Right. Well, Professor, another key aspect of the bill is the community remedial initiative, which allows individuals who have committed less severe racial offenses to repair community ties instead of, facing prosecution. Do you think this approach will be effective in fostering genuine reconciliation?
Yes. So this is a non-punitive measure, meaning that in appropriate cases, so this means, non-egregious acts, that threaten racial harmony. It gives the authorities the option of applying this non-punitive measure, which of course, the person, the offender, will have to agree to in the first place. And I think most offenders would, because the alternative would then that they'll be dealt with, by the law, which will then bring in punitive measures, such as jail time. But I think the value in this non-punitive measure, the community remedial initiative, is that it still holds the offender accountable, but it affords him the opportunity, to voluntarily reconcile his differences, with the offended racial group. So this focus on the rehabilitation of the offender and providing the opportunity, for him to repair his ties, with the offended community, I think, will work only where the offender is genuinely remorseful over his actions, right? And is serious about wanting to make amends. People have said that, this could be a easier or softer option. I don't think so. I think in many ways it's more challenging, right? Because you need to have the offender as well as the racial community being prepared and willing, to purposefully engage each other. But I think, this way, if the remedial measure does indeed work, then I think, you have all parties coming to a better understanding. And I think, that would be much better for race relations, rather, because you could just throw the offender into jail, for example, or fine him, but if the offender goes away with the same views, right, and let's say he or she is still prepared to use whatever offensive word that he or she did, then we're back to square one, So I think this additional measure and non-punitive in nature, can help in race relations in Singapore.
I see. Well, Professor, foreign influence is another important issue addressed in the bill. Now, with the introduction of new safeguards, race-based entities such as clan and business associations will now be required to disclose foreign affiliations and donations. How significant is the risk of, foreign interference in Singapore's racial landscape? And do you think that these measures strike the right balance between security and openness?
So I think, it is not a significant threat at this point in time when we talk about foreign interference, but we cannot afford to be complacent, right? Because as many examples have shown, even in Singapore in political matters, right, there have been attempts to interfere with domestic politics. And so our racial diversity, is a strength. But it can also be a vulnerability that external actors could attempt to exploit. So I look at the countermeasures, in the racial harmony law, really as putting in place, baseline safeguards, right? And maybe this is where it'd be useful to disclose, to mention what these safeguards are. So it's essentially a reporting requirement, right, of foreign donations or anonymous donations, above specified amounts. Secondly, to disclose, foreign persons or organizations that are able to exert control or power over the race-based entity. And then, the third disclosure relates to the race entity's leadership composition. So I think, they don't curb, genuine activities, that seek to promote culture, between a race-based entity as well as a foreign organization. After all, we are an immigrant society, right? So we have Singaporeans who can trace their ancestry, to different parts of the world. So I these safeguards are really to just again, be an annual reminder, to race-based entities, to ensure, that they are exerting control over their activities, that they are not doing, some other entities bidding, that perhaps would require them to engage in acts that would threaten racial harmony. So I would say that, whether an entity is engaged in cultural or commercial objectives, with a foreign entity, they need not fear this particular law, and I think so long as, these race-based entities bear in mind the cardinal principle that, that in all their dealings with foreign counterparts, that they must not compromise racial harmony, this law would just be, will not affect, in any way, their interactions with foreign entities.
I see. Well, Professor, on a broader level, laws governing racial harmony, they're always evolving, but some critics do worry that over-regulation in this area could create a chilling effect on public discussions about race. So how can policymakers ensure that Singaporeans remain open to difficult but necessary conversations about racial issues without fear of legal repercussions?
Yes, so I think that's certainly a valid and justifiable concern. And I think, one should bear in mind that this new law, does not require individuals or race-based entities to conduct themselves any differently, right? And I think, when you, as Singapore society matures, I think, we will see people wanting to have more public discussions about race. And I think, there have been a lot more discussions. When I was in university more than 30 years ago, one couldn't there wasn't even a course in the university about race relations in Singapore, right? But in the last 10, 15 years, I have myself conducted, courses on race relations in Singapore. So I think there's a lot more openness, right? And I think there is a recognition that you can't put this topics, out of bounds. But I think the key thing, Hongbin, really is how do Singaporeans go about discussing these sensitive issues, which require, as you mentioned, difficult but necessary conversation, right? So how can we, have a civil and respectful conversation about some of these very difficult issues, right? Differences in outlook, on a variety of matters that concern race. So to me, it's the how question, not so much, that, we are now going to keep all this emotions and concerns bottled up. I don't think that's the intention of the law. In fact, I think that would be very much, a step backwards. So I think the law would actually enable more of these discussions, but with safeguards in place, with people knowing that, there must be that respect and dignity accorded, to someone from a different race who may have a different view.
I see. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for your time and your insights today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. That was Associate Professor Eugene Tan from the Singapore Management University School of Law. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.